Hey, Lakeshore family, Pastor Charlie here, along with my wife, Louise. We wanted to talk to you about cultivating oneness in a marriage. Sweetheart, why is that even important?
Oh, very important because our natural bent is to be self-focused. We don't say that, but it comes out in our actions and in the way that we live our day-to-day life as a married couple. You might be a mom with young children, or you might be someone who has a career. It's so easy to get wrapped up in your life as an individual rather than as a couple, a married couple.
Yeah, and I remember early on in our marriage when we were being mentored in the ways of the Lord and also in our marriage, we had somebody say this illustration to us, and it had to do with two train tracks. And they were giving the example of a marriage is like two train tracks,
Yes.
and the train tracks are going in the same direction, if you will. They're coming, they're going this way. They're side by side. But here was the challenge: is the couple in this case, they never came together and touched. So they were going this way, but they didn't touch enough. And that's a problem in a
Yes.
marriage. And I think that basically would help us to set up our conversation, at least for this day. You know, the Bible has a lot to say about a husband and a wife and oneness. And I think the verse that sums it up the best would be Ephesians 5:31 through 32. So, sweetheart, could you read that?
Sure, absolutely. It says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh."
Yeah, so as we talk with you for a few minutes, we want to make sure we cover the following with you. Again, the topic is cultivating oneness in a marriage, but we want to cover with you communication. Obviously, that is critical in a marriage. We want to talk about the barriers to communication. So, again, communication, what are the barriers to communication? And then moving towards oneness. Or are you moving towards isolation? Big difference, and we'll break that down for you so you can see which side of the tracks you're on. So the first thing we're going to talk about is communication. And in a marriage, we have to place a priority on communication. But I know there's a few people that go, I don't even know what that means, or maybe it's not your gifting, if you will, and you need a little bit of help. So Louise, how can one place priority in their marriage on the subject of communication?
Yeah, I think first understanding that, we go through different seasons in a marriage. And so maybe how you communicated one season needs to change in another season. And I know for me and Charlie, just, sometimes I want to talk and he just doesn't want to talk, or there isn't a right time for me to talk to him about certain things.
Well, it depends on what it is.
Exactly.
Right? So, yeah.
But I think even just as a couple, we have intentionally made a decision that we're committed to make communication a priority.
Yeah, and it is a commitment. I mean, it's not easy to do, and I think some people out there might think that am I the only one where it's hard to talk, it's hard to connect with your spouse. So you just got done saying that there are times in our marriage where you find it hard to connect with me, or I might say something along the lines like, it's just not a good time, and then you would say what?
Yes, I would say, but I need to talk with
Right,
you.
or it's never a good time, right?
Right,
Yeah, but
right.
there needs to be a good time, right?
Yeah, well, communication does affect your marriage. And, in Proverbs 18:21, it talks about, death and life are in the power of the tongue. So we're using our words on a daily basis. We're either building up our marriage
Yes.
or we're destroying it. Either it can be by the words we speak or the words we're not speaking. And so just understanding that communication plays that much of an important role in our marriage,
Yeah.
it has to be prioritized.
Here's one thing that we've learned is regular communication drives intimacy. Let me say that again. Regular, consistent communication drives intimacy. Now, the word intimacy, it means different things to different people. It certainly means oftentimes different things to men than it does to women. So Louise, maybe speak for the women, at least most of the women, on the subject of intimacy. And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, there can be not just physical intimacy, but emotional intimacy, where you're wanting to connect with your husband, not just the day-to-day conversation, but something deeper where you're really wanting to enter his world and you want him to enter into your world through understanding. And so emotional intimacy is important because it does lead to physical intimacy, one that's deep and rich.
Yeah. And if we think about that, we can have fun and we can be really playful here, but at the end of the day, both of those things are important. And what I mean by that is physical intimacy and emotional intimacy, but they both go with each other. They go together. So we have to get good at both of those things. They go together. So intimacy is key. And if we have regular communication, consistent communication, it leads to both of those things. Also, by coming together and communicating regularly, often, it's going to drive growth into the marriage. So what are some ways that communication drives growth into the marriage?
Well, it certainly allows you to address things that need to be addressed on a regular basis, but even just becoming aware that, as I alluded to previously, just that, you're going to be in different seasons. And so you're going to have to learn to communicate differently. I know for Charlie and I, that saying that says, if you keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, that's the definition of insanity. And so I came to this conclusion. We just kind of hit like a roadblock in our own communication. And the Lord really just showed me, like, you need to change your communication with your husband, because you're trying to communicate the same way, but there's no results happening. And so really even understanding that, good, strong communication, it's going to lead your marriage to grow, but also yourself. So I'm changing how I'm communicating in this season of life.
Yeah, and that's what drives the growth. Growth is, like Louise just got done saying, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result is insanity. So we have to change. We have to be looking like, hey, I want to grow. I want to grow as a Christian, as a follower of Christ. And when we're committed to that, we want to grow in all of our relationships with Christ and even our husband, wife, and all relationships. So hope that's helpful.
Yes.
Okay, so point number 2 is barriers to communication. What are those things that are impeding good communication? So if we think about this, I think most of us would know that barriers to communication would be pride and selfishness. But there's a verse that really makes us step back and think a little bit. What's that verse, sweetheart?
Oh, sure. That's Proverbs 12:18. And it says this: there is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing.
Yeah, I mean, think about that verse. I mean, obviously, we know that there's grace-filled words. I mean, when we think about grace-filled words, I mean, those are good words, right? So what are some of those types of words? Maybe just in the context of a marriage, what are some words that we can use that are grace-filled?
Yeah, just even thinking about decisions that, you're making as a couple. And ultimately, your husband is the spiritual leader. And so you want him to be the one making the decisions. But just, grace-filled words might be, have you considered this?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, think of it. That kind of stops the traffic a little bit. Have you considered this? That's full. It's dripping with grace because it's coming at it from a position of, I want to understand. I want to hear you. I want to see you. That's a great example of a grace-filled word. But the opposite of a grace-filled word would be a pride-filled word.
Right.
So what would be an example of that, sweetheart?
Yeah, that would be like, you should do this. Another example might be, I expect you to do this.
Yeah, or you always do that.
Right.
Like those are kind of fighting words, right? And I think we're kind of already lit, and that's a negative thing, to be lit when we start using words like that. But they're not.
Yeah, because pride-filled, it's demanding. You're saying you should do this rather than taking a posture of being humble.
Yeah.
And that's where we know, as we are reading in James 4:6, that God opposes the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. And so when we're using the right words, we're coming in a posture of humility. And that's where God's grace, reigns and rules through our lives.
One of the things that is helpful is to be thinking about grace-filled words when we're dealing with conflict. So grace-filled words when we're dealing with conflict, what are some ways that we can do that?
Oh, sure. Just, as a wife, approaching your husband by saying, help me to understand why perhaps you did this, ...
Yeah.
Those are grace-filled words. The opposite?
Yeah, would be demanding, and that would be something like, hey, what were you thinking? I can't believe you did this. Again, it's those accusatory words that don't do anything but just light a fire, right?
Yeah, and it's definitely not seeking to understand. You're already making a judgment call that they did something out of a motive that in your mind you've already placed on them.
Yeah, and remember our goal in all things, and again, no one's perfect at this, but our goal in all things are to honor Christ, to honor Christ in all of our dealings, including our communication. So it's not okay to not use grace-filled
Yeah.
words. There's grace for it, but it's not okay to just let it rip, right?
Yeah. Well, I know there are times when I have said things to you, and
Yes.
I think you've told me that you automatically shut down. It just
Yeah.
doesn't invite, let's talk. It actually invites the very opposite, which is, I
Yeah.
want to talk.
So if we're going into a communication and we all have a desired outcome, right? And the desired outcome could be a good thing, a noble thing, a God honoring thing. But if our desired outcome is X and then we're using words that are not grace filled, we're not going to get the outcome and we're not going to honor God, right?
Yeah, because you're putting, it's actually stopping God's grace from flowing in and through your marriage when you are using words that are filled with pride. Because remember, God tells us in His Word that He opposes the proud.
Yeah, and that's what it says in James 4:6. It says, but He gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So you want God to oppose you? Keep being prideful.
Yeah.
Do you want God to give you grace? Keep being humble. In other
Yes.
words, go low so God can bring you high.
Yes.
Yeah. So here's a question. Are you moving towards oneness or are you moving towards isolation? We're going to talk about that. So remember earlier I talked about those train tracks, the marriage, they're going in the same direction, but they're not touching enough. Those are the train tracks, right? So if we can use that illustration for a second, I want you to think about this. Which way are you going? Are you heading towards oneness? Or are you moving towards isolation? Remember what Satan's goal is. It's always isolation, to get you by yourself and get you in the danger zone. That's what Satan's goal is and always has been. It's one of the strategies of the enemy. As a matter of fact, God's word says something very clear about that. What would that be?
Yeah, in Proverbs 18:1, it says this: whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment.
Yeah, and when we get alone, when we are alone, when we get alone and we are alone, we start to hear the voice of Satan a whole heck of a lot louder. And not only that, we start believing it. You start believing a lot of things that are not true when you are isolated. You hear things that are true, not true, that pertain to your marriage and to all your key relationships. Isn't that true, sweetheart?
Absolutely. There are times I know in our own marriage where I have thought something to be true about Charlie that absolutely was the furthest thing from the truth. But because I wasn't reaching out, trying to communicate and understand, Satan got myself alone and isolated with my own thoughts. And that just put me down a very bad trail.
Yeah, and all of us, and I could say the same thing as it pertains to Louise. So we're all, I would say, guilty as charged. But this is not where, Louise and I want to play gotcha. We just want to support you, and we want you to know that we understand.
Yeah.
But our thoughts start being preyed upon and attacked when we're isolated, and we start believing things are not even true, like you just got done talking about. So, but what are some other ways that cause isolation, sweetheart, in a marriage?
Yeah, well, definitely not reaching out would be one, and really not making communication a priority. We talked about that earlier. It has to be a priority in your marriage. And I think even just asking yourself, what are you doing to prioritize communication? We had shared about in a recent taping just about our Think Day. That's a day that we set aside for ourselves to actually prioritize communication. And I can tell you for myself, it actually brings encouragement knowing that I have a day where I'm going to sit down with my husband. He can't go anywhere, and we're going to talk about some things that need to be talked about. So that's prioritizing communication. That's moving towards oneness and not isolation.
And here's another way where we can start focusing more towards isolation. When we start to say things like, when we need to talk, and then we say something like this, I can't talk to him, or I can't talk to her. And when we say we can't talk to him or talk to her, guess what we do? We stop talking, right?
Oh, yes.
And that produces isolation, right?
Right,
That would be an
right.
example. That's bad news. The other thing that we do that's not helpful is we just say things like this. I've got the problem, and it's just easier not to what? Easier just not to
Not
deal
to deal
with
with it, yeah.
And we don't deal with it, right?
Right.
And it creates more isolation.
Isolation, right.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So these things are not true. I can't talk to him. I can't talk to her. Yeah, you can, and you need to. It's sometimes that's the way that we talk. But these types of things, when we believe them to be true, I can't talk to him. I can't talk to her. It creates isolation, and it's very, very bad for the marriage.
Yeah, and we actually need to do the opposite, which is we need to choose to put on Christ. We need to take our thoughts captive and make them obedient to Christ, because in those moments we are choosing to believe something that's not true and to isolate ourselves, and we actually need to put on Christ. We have the mind of Christ, and we need to remember that in marriage we're one. The two have become one.
Yeah.
So if I'm starting to move away, I'm definitely not moving in the truth of the gospel. I'm moving away from Christ. So
Yes.
I need to put on Christ. I
Yes.
need to seek out and do what I can to make sure that we're communicating.
Yes, and here's a big one. We start to work things out in our mind, and we start saying things like, "Well, he or she, husband, wife, does not deserve for me to give the grace in this situation because they've done it before, or this keeps happening, or these are lies, right?
Right.
So if we think about that, and if we think about that in line with the gospel, that could be a dangerous thing, or it could be a beautiful thing. So we put on Christ, Christ who forgives, Christ who forgave,
Yes.
Christ who's lavished us with his grace and his goodness. And that's what we're to put on. None of us deserve grace, but by God's grace, we are given grace, and we extend that same grace in a marriage so that we can be one.
Yes.
Because that's what God demands for us. Yeah. With Christ in view, let us think about that. Are we going to be a people that are more known as being a selfish people or a sacrificial people? So as we imitate Christ, sweetheart, we would know that when our marriage is thriving, we're doing a lot more sacrificial giving and loving to one
Yes.
another than we are being selfish. Selfishness, we know, creates a lot of problems in our marriage, but that's the problem. You and I are two sinful people and two selfish people, and oftentimes we drag that into our marriage, and it creates a lot of problems. But with that in view, sweetheart, what are some things that maybe we can encourage people to be imitators of Christ or to be that sacrificial people?
Yeah, first of all, just really understanding that marriage, it's not about you, but it's about God's glory.
Yeah.
And Charlie and I were just talking about this the other day, and, I was just bringing up, something that's helpful, that I think both of us can do on a regular basis, just asking the question,
Yeah.
how can I help you?
Yeah. What a question. How can I help you? That's a powerful question.
It is.
And Louise does ask that question. I need to ask it more, but she does ask that question consistently. That's a beautiful question. Those are grace words again, right?
Yeah, because that really is putting ourself aside and looking to the needs of your spouse.
Yeah.
And that's something that I want to continue to cultivate in myself as a wife. I want my husband to know that I'm his helper.
Yeah.
I am there for him. And those are words right there that will cultivate like sacrificial living. How can I help you?
Yeah.
What can I do to help you? What can I do to make your life easier?
Yeah, and those are life-giving. That's helpful, and that is Christ. I mean, that is Christ in and through you, and you're imitating Christ. And we're in a marriage. First of all, we got to step back and understand that yes, we're going to have challenges in
Yes.
marriage, right? Challenges are going to be in every key relationship, especially the marriage. And remember this, that in a marriage, you are going to be given plenty of opportunities to die to yourself. As a matter of fact, you're going to get so many opportunities that you could literally become an expert in learning how to die to yourself. So
yourself,
we need to learn that lesson and become experts in it. So that's what we're commanded and demanded to do, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and in Romans 8:28, it says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. So we know that everything that we're going through, the hard things in a marriage, God is using that for our good and for His glory if we choose to sacrifice
Yeah.
and allow ourselves to serve our spouse in a way that is sacrificial.
Yeah. And again, going back to this last point, if you will, we talk a lot about things that are essential. We live in a world right now. What is essential? What's not essential? In a marriage, sacrifice is essential. I think of this one verse, and this verse has been described by many people as the gospel in miniature. And I want you to listen to this popular verse and think about the sacrifice, think about Christ, think about marriage, think about laying oneself down. And then maybe in this context, think about your marriage. It's John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave. He gave.
Yes.
He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Someone had to die. Someone had to sacrifice to get the beauty on the other end of it. And Christ is calling us to do the same thing. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I like what you said, at the beginning, which is the pattern of sacrifice is essential for a healthy marriage.
Yeah.
It is.
So let that be true in your life, and let's work at it together. I think we say in our marriage often, we've learned it from somebody else, I'm sure, but we say something like this. What is it? Pattern? What is it? Perfection? How do we say that again?
We said it's progress.
That's it.
Progress over perfection,
See,
and that's what we want to see in our marriage.
Just now you just watched this mess up a little bit, but that's what makes life worth living. It makes it real. No one's perfect. We're not always going to memorize things we need to memorize. And this marriage that you're in, the relationship that we're in, it's not going to be perfect. There's only one perfect one. We are striving towards perfection. And that is what happens in a marriage. The marriage will sanctify you as you die to yourself, but the goal is always to imitate Christ and die, be sacrificial, and God will help. Amen?
Yes. Amen.